Hello, famous names in Hollywood, this same workshop. And now I want to share with you some of the things I've learned. The purpose of this workshop is to guide you through the process of writing a screenplay, from the inception of the idea to the actual completion of the finished script. Now, some of you may have already written a screenplay. Some of you may be journalists, novelists, or copywriters, and now you want to write a screenplay. And maybe some of you have never written anything before, but you have an idea and you know it's going to make an interesting workshop, is going to guide you through the process of writing a screenplay. It's about writing the screenplay you want to write, a screenplay that you can be proud of. First, writing a screenplay is a process that's always changing, always evolving, and therefore it's larger than you are. What you write today is going to be out of date tomorrow, and what you write tomorrow is going to be out of date the day after tomorrow, and so on. So don't be too attached to your initial ideas and concepts. The only thing that ultimately matters is what works within the context of the screenplay. The rule is, if it works, use it. And if it doesn't, don't. Second, I want to talk about discipline. A lot of people worry about having the discipline to write a screenplay. Some of you may have a full-time job. Some of you have a family. Some of you have both. But whatever your individual circumstances, the problems of discipline are always the same. What's important is to find the best time of day or evening for you to write the screenplay. It could be before you go to work in the morning. It could be after you get home from work at night. You have to decide what works for you. No one else can tell you. This is your course. You find the time and work at your own pace within the structure of the workshop. Now let's talk about this course for a moment. The first time you view this, you may want to watch it in its entirety. Section, you'll receive your assignment. Just stop the tape and do the exercise. Writing is a step-by-step, day-by-day process, so don't try to do everything at one time. That's why the course is broken down into 4 complete sections. The first section is getting started. We'll start with the idea, then break it down into an action and character. Then we'll structure it into a complete dramatic entity with beginning, middle, and end. Then we'll write a 4. In part 2, we'll create the characters, define their dramatic needs, plot their course of action, their emotional arc, and discuss the nature and function of dialogue. Part 3 is where we actually write the screenplay. Again, we'll work in individual units of dramatic action. We'll begin by setting up, structuring, and then writing Act 1. We then prepare, structure, and write Act 2. Then we prepare, structure, and write Act 3. And that will complete the first words-on-paper draft of your screenplay. Part 4 is where we rewrite the screenplay, tightening, polishing, honing the first draft. When you complete this course, you'll have written a professional screenplay ready to submit to Hollywood. And one more thing. During this course, I'm going to be using several films as examples to illustrate the process of screenwriting. I chose these films carefully because they are excellent teaching films. The 3 films are The Shawshank Redemption, Titanic, and Thelma and Louise. These are all excellent films, and you should view them before beginning this course and writing your own screenplay. The first thing we need to do is define what a screenplay is, and we do that by defining first what it's not. A screenplay is not a novel. When you read a novel, you'll see that the action takes place inside the character's head, in the mindscape of dramatic action. When you see a play, it takes place on a stage, in front of an audience, and the action takes place through the character's words, through the language of dramatic action. But a screenplay is different. A screenplay is a story told in pictures, with dialogue and description, and placed within the context of dramatic structure. Now, I'm going to be referring to this definition throughout the course. What's the first thing you need to write a screenplay? It's obvious. You need an idea. Then you have to form that idea into a subject. In the language of screenwriting, the subject is an action and a character. So who is your story about? Who's your main character? And what happens? And how does it end? Before you start writing one word of your screenplay, you must be able to define what your story is. His wife and her lover, and after spending 19 years of time for a crime he didn't commit, he escapes to Mexico. Now that's not the story. That's what the story is about. Your subject is not meant to tell the entire story. It's only meant to be a guide for you to organize the story. Now we're going to talk about screenplay structure. There are two definitions of the word structure. The first definition is to build something or put something together. And the second definition of structure is the relationship between the parts and the whole. Take the game of chess, for example. There are 4 parts that make up a chess game. 1, the pieces. You can't play chess without the pieces, the knight, the queen, the bishop, the pawn, and so on. 2, the board, because you can't play chess without a board. And 3, you need players or a player. And 4, the rules. You take away any one of these 4 elements, and you do not have a chess game, because it's the relationship between these elements, between the parts and the whole, that make up a chess game. And that's what structure is, the relationship between costumes, locations, music, special effects. All these parts make up the whole, which is the story. Now this brings us to what I call the paradigm. The paradigm is a model. I created it to be an instructional tool. For example, a table is a top with legs. But within the paradigm of the table, you could have a low table, a high table, a round table, a square table, and so on. You get the idea. Now, in the same way, a screenplay can be illustrated as a paradigm. And this is an essential tool in understanding the structural nature of a screenplay. And here's what it looks like. All stories have 3 things in common. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning corresponds to Act 1. The middle corresponds to Act 2, and the end corresponds to Act 3. Remember, a screenplay is a story told with pictures, in dialogue and description, and placed within the context of dramatic structure. Acts 1, 2, and 3 are individual units of dramatic action. Now, most movies are about 2 hours in length, and 1 page of screenplay equals approximately 1 minute of screen time. Therefore, the average screenplay is approximately 120 pages long. The way it breaks down is that Act 1 is a unit of dramatic action that's approximately 22 to 30 pages long. Act 2 is a unit of dramatic action that's approximately 60 pages long. And Act 3 is a unit of dramatic action that's approximately. The screenplay is a story told in pictures, with dialogue and description, and placed within the context of dramatic structure? Well, context is a space. For example, if you take a glass, there's this does not change. That space is the context. Even if I got creative and I put nuts or trail mix or raisins or grapes, the space inside the glass remains the same. The context does not change. Only the content changes. Now, since we're talking about dramatic structure, there is a dramatic context. The context for Act 1, for example, is called the setup, because in this first 30-page unit of dramatic action, you must set up and establish the dramatic premise, the characters, the situations, and the relationships between the characters. Act 2 is a unit of dramatic action that's approximately 60 pages long and is held together with a dramatic context known as confrontation. Your character must encounter obstacle after obstacle to achieve his or her dramatic need. As we'll find out later, the dramatic need is what your main character wants to win or gain or get or achieve during the course of your screenplay. Act 3 is a unit of dramatic action that's held together by the dramatic context known as resolution. Now, resolution does not mean end. Resolution means solution. What's the solution of your story? The end. The end is that last scene or sequence of the script. Beginning, middle, and end. Setup, confrontation, resolution. Now, the next question is, how do we get from the beginning of the story to the middle? And how do we get from the middle to the end? The answer is to create a plot point at the end of Act 1 and a plot point at the end of Act 2. It's that event that takes us from Act 1 into Act 2 and from Act 2 into Act 3. Now, there are many plot points in the screenplay, but right now we're only focusing on plot point 1 and plot point 2. Before you can write one word of the screenplay, there are 4 elements that you must know. You must know the end, you must know the beginning, you must know plot point 1, and you must know plot point 2. This is the paradigm of dramatic structure. Notice the relationship between the parts and the whole. Act 1 in relationship to Act 2, and Act 2 in relationship to Act 3. That's the structure of a screenplay. Now, structure is flexible. It's like a tree that bends in the wind but does not break. So what we do is take our idea and determine the ending. We determine the beginning, then determine plot points 1 and 2. And that brings us to our first assignment. Create the subject of your screenplay. Who is the main character and what is your story about? Is your story about a woman executive on vacation in Hawaii who meets a man, has an affair, returns home, only to learn the relationship doesn't work? That's the subject. Now, if you put the subject onto the paradigm, you start with the ending, the resolution first. The relationship does not work. So then, what's the opening of the story? We show the woman executive at work. What's plot point 1? She leaves for Hawaii for her vacation, and it's there that she meets the young man. What's plot point 2? She leaves Hawaii and returns home. Now that's your first assignment. Take your idea and put it into a subject, and then structure the subject on the paradigm. And now you're ready for part 2 of the assignment. We know 4 things about our storyline. We know the ending, the beginning, plot point 1, and plot point 2. Now, using these structural elements, we're going to write a 4-page treatment, which is a narrative synopsis of the storyline. This is what I call a kick-in-the-ass exercise. Why? You don't know much about the detail of your story. You don't know about your characters, where they've come from, what their goals are, or what their dramatic need is. So you're trying to take an unformed idea and give it some kind of form. And it's difficult because you don't have enough information. The purpose, and here's how we do this. On a half a page, write the opening scene or sequence in a dramatic narrative. Then, on a half page, summarize the action that occurs in Act 1. And then, in another half page, write the plot point at the end of Act 1 in a dramatic narrative. Now, obstacles can be internal, external, physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual. And most of them will be a combination of those. Now, on another sheet of paper, summarize each of the obstacles your character encounters in about a paragraph. Describe the obstacle and how your character deals with it. Next, in one half page, write the plot point at the end of Act 2 in a dramatic narrative. And then, in another half page, summarize the action of Act 3, the resolution. And finally, in a half a page, I want you to write the end scene or sequence in a dramatic narrative. And one more thing. When you've completed this exercise, do not show it to your wives, lovers, husband, friends, or family. You heard me right. Do not show it to anyone, because they'll either kill you with kindness or destroy you with their well-meaning intentions. Your idea is so fragile right now that a single question from a friend or a loved one could absolutely cause you to question and undermine your own story. Let the 4-page treatment be what it is, a start point. The key to this exercise is being willing to write 4 terrible pages. And as you're writing, I want you to remember that. So now that you have your assignments, it's time to start writing. So let's do it. To give you an illustration of what we're going to be doing, here's a sample 4-page treatment. As I read it, you follow along. In a dream, Jennifer stares into a child's bedroom. She moves through the room looking at a photograph of a man standing next to a young boy in the mountains. The inscription reads, "Hide in the yard." She sits on the floor, draws her body into a ball, and begins crying. An alarm clock awakens Jennifer from the dream. She gets up and goes to the room where the dream occurred and awakens her teenage son, Brad. Her insistence only worsens the situation. During their argument, she discovers a letter from Brad's father, encouraging his son to move back to the Midwest with him. Jennifer is outraged. Brad pleads with his mother to let him live with his father. Jennifer refuses to talk to him about living more than 2,000 miles away. She ends the argument with, "Your father is just putting damn foolish ideas into your head." Brad continues to disrupt life with his mother by poor performance in school and inexcusable act, her physical inability to do the manly tasks of throwing footballs and lifting weights. Jennifer fears she's losing her son. She decides to increase her time with him and puts him before men, work, and her own good time, but her efforts do little to gain respect or appreciation from him. He's determined to get his way and prove to her that she can't provide for his needs as affection. Jennifer, while running with her friend Jane, confides in her and relates her perception of the problem. Jennifer blames Brad's father for causing all the trouble and states that she's determined to find a way to turn Brad around. As they are running, Jennifer spots a poster advertising a wilderness trip. Wilderness Survival Adventures, a journey that develops control of our lives. Jennifer mentions that that's the kind of thing Brad's father does to win his son over to his side. She explains that she's not that adventurous and dismisses the subject. After they separate, Jennifer abruptly changes directions, returns to the poster, and tears it down. At home, she holds the poster in front of Brad and announces they're going on an adventure. Brad laughs at her. "My mom in the wilderness? That'll be the day." She begins making preparations for the journey. Jennifer and Brad prepare and travel by train to Montana, where they are greeted, instructed, and checked out by the expedition staff headed by Red Travis. Red flies them by helicopter into the wilderness, and they spend an uneventful but humorous 2-day scenic journey, hiking, swimming, fishing, staff. Jennifer boasts with pride of their accomplishments, and Brad has all but forgotten the war they had at home. On the first evening of the second phase of their journey, after leaving the staff, they discover they must cross a rapidly raging river. They decide to pass their packs across by hand. During the process, Brad loses his balance and falls into the raging waters. Jennifer panics, drops her pack, and jumps in to save Brad. Her attempts to save him fail, and they tumble through the turbulent white waters. Brad's thrown into a cluster of boulders, and Jennifer is washed over the rapids and dumped into an eddy below. She climbs out just in time to watch their packs tumble down the river out of sight. She looks for Brad and finds him half drowning and crying in pain and shock. Jennifer frees the boulder trapping his foot and pulls him out of the water. Brad cannot walk and is in a great deal of pain. The mishap has taken them far away from their trail, and Jennifer realizes they're in serious trouble. She decides to stay with Brad rather than go for help or look for their gear. Their pockets contain nothing but wet matches, a knife, and one roll of film. During the next 3 days, Jennifer, unable to find the packs, manages to keep them alive by various acts of survival: building a fire without matches, catching a fish barehanded, making a shelter from dead branches, and Brad's condition continues to worsen, and he begs his mother to go for help. When Jennifer realizes that it's time they were missed by the expedition staff, she struggles to carry Brad to the meadow where the markers have been placed. Brad's ankle and leg are swollen, and he goes in and out of consciousness, asking for his father. Jennifer's the many feelings about her inadequacies as a mother and person of all their problems. She's close to giving up hope for rescue when a helicopter flown by Red circles above them. He's unable to land in the meadow and must lower a basket to lift them aboard. The doctors want to call the family to help them get home, but Brad and Jennifer decide they can manage anything together after this incident. They are awarded badges from the expedition staff for their incredible acts of survival. Traveling home on the train, Brad boasts to strangers about their incredible journey and his mother saving their lives. When they return home, Brad's airline tickets have arrived for a summer vacation with his father. Jennifer asks Brad if he still wants to live with his father, and he explains that he wishes he could live in both places. He begs his mother to consider moving back to the Midwest, but she only shares how impossible that would be for her. Her reaction to this situation has mellowed, and she seems to really listen to Brad. And while running with her friend Jane, Jennifer informs her that she has decided that Brad should live with his father on a trial basis. Jane is shocked at Jennifer's change. Jennifer explains the transformation and that all mothers must let go of their children someday anyway. She's most concerned that Brad will always resent her if he isn't free to experience his father. Jennifer tells Brad how she feels, and although he's somewhat reluctant to leave her, they pack most of his belongings for a 6-month trial living arrangement with his father. Jennifer takes Brad to the airport, and they tearfully make their departure. She hands Brad the only remains of their trip, a photograph of them together, standing amid the mountains with the inscription, "Love, Mom." Jennifer returns home and enters Brad's bedroom. The football lies on the unmade bed. The closet is empty. The dresser is empty. And the photo of Brad with his dad is still on the dresser. She looks out the window and sees a bicycle lying on its side. She falls to the floor and rolls into a ball and cries. After a few moments, the telephone rings. Wiping away her tears, she answers, "Oh, hi, Jane." "No, nothing. Just surviving." So if structure is the foundation of creating your characters now, Henry James, the great American novelist, once asked a question about creating character. And the question was this: what is character but the determination of incident? And what is incident but the illumination of character? The word incident is the key. What is the incident that drives your story forward? Because it's the key that's going to start the engine, that's going to power the story that you want to tell. In The Shawshank Redemption, for example, it's the murder of Andy Dufresne's wife and her lover that sets the entire storyline in motion. And once that incident is determined, then you can begin to determine the causes that would let your character develop. So the first question we have to ask ourselves in creating character is this: what makes good character? There are 4 things that make good character. Number 1, you need a strong dramatic need. Number 2, you need a strong point of view. Number 3, you need an attitude. And number 4, you need change. So dramatic need, as defined, is this: what does your main character want to win or gain or get or achieve during the course of your screenplay? The dramatic need is always simple, and therein lies its complexity. Every character has a dramatic need, because the source of all drama is conflict. If you can create your character's dramatic need, then you can create conflict that's built into the story, and your characters become more real, multidimensional, and we can identify with them completely. All the characters' dramatic needs can usually be explained in a few words. In The Shawshank Redemption, for example, Andy Dufresne needs to survive in prison the best way he can. And yet the one real dramatic need for every prisoner is what? To escape, of course. Now, you as writer do not need to spell out your character's dramatic need. It doesn't have to be in the dialogue or the screenplay anywhere. But yet you have to know it, and you have to dramatize it. You have to give it a form and illustrate it with your character's behavior. Film is behavior. In Thelma and Louise, both characters have the same dramatic need: to escape safely to Mexico. Now, obviously, during the course of action, they'll grow and they'll learn things about themselves. After all, theirs is a story of self-discovery and enlightenment. So look at Titanic. What's Jack's dramatic need? Rose's dramatic need, or Cal's? Well, Jack's dramatic need is simple. Number 1, he gets on the boat so he can return to America. But once he meets Rose, his dramatic need changes, and it's to put their differences in class aside and to win her affection. And Rose's need at the beginning? to free herself from Cal's oppressive domination. Women, of course, at that time are only an object, a trophy, an ornament to be seen on the arm of the man. And that's how most of the men on the Titanic of his class relate to her. But she wants to be free. She wants to be liberated, serving her own destiny. And Jack is the instrument that allows her to do that. She even tells him after they make love that she's getting off the boat with him once they dock in America. And Cal's dramatic need? He only wants one thing. He wants to win Rose's affections and make her his wife, according to what he thinks a wife should be, a lovely accessory to decorate his lifestyle. And that's what makes it a good match. And remember what her mother tells her. But, she says, we know we're different. We're women. The third thing that makes good character, attitude. Now, attitude is defined as a manner or an opinion. Now, you've heard about people being superior or feeling inferior, or a person who thinks he or she is always right. Well, that's an attitude. You can also have some kind of an attitude as being too conservative, or too liberal, or too optimistic, too pessimistic, or opportunistic. All these are attitudes that can really enhance your character. Cal's attitude, for example, is being cavalier toward women. And he's cavalier toward the waiters or the employees of the ship because they're all considered objects, not real people. I want you to treat me like a wife is supposed to treat her husband, Cal tells Rose after she dances with Jack in third class. That's his attitude, his manner, or his opinion. And Rose's mother's attitude is, as she says, the purpose of the university is to find a husband. You know, that's their role as women. Because they're women, they can't have a career or be independent. They're subservient to the men, and that's why the match is so important. Plus the fact they have no money, only debts. Now, you can show attitude, or you can have your character talk about it through dialogue to another person. Rose shows her attitude. In their very first meal at the captain's table, Rose is found smoking a cigarette. Now, at that time, a lady doesn't smoke in public. And that's when Cal forcibly takes the cigarette away from her. And Molly Brown asks sarcastically, "Are you going to cut her meat?" Change. Does your character change during the course of your screenplay? Can you trace that emotional arc of the change during the script? The key to building character is the transformation of the character. In what way does your character change? So look at the way Rose changes. She feels suffocated by the rules of her class, where women have no freedom, no choice. And the older Rose says, "I saw my life as an endless parade of parties and cotillions, yachts and polo matches. Always the same narrow people, the same mindless chatter. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a great precipice with no one to pull me back, no one who cared or even noticed." And this occurs right before plot point 1, which is that point in the story where Jack saves Rose from jumping overboard. And what is it that brings about her change? After the talk with her mother, Jack sneaks up to the upper deck of society. The purpose of the university, Rose's mother says, is to find a husband, not to educate the person. To find a husband. And she looks over at the next table, and what does she see? A little girl about 9 or 10 being trained by her mother in the process of correct behavior, learning correct manners, as befitting a woman of her class. That scene, that observation, is what pushes Rose away from her class and into the arms of Jack. And when they're together, he shows her how to fly as they stand at the bow. A little scene that reveals to Rose what her life has been and what it's to become. And she wants no part of that. And that is what leads to her change her emotional arc. Of course, all characters don't have to change. They can be the same at the end of the story as they were at the beginning. But usually the main character in a movie today undergoes some kind of change. I mean, look at Andy Dufresne in The Shawshank Redemption. It's because of his change, going from thinking he's really guilty in the cause of his wife's murder. The character biography. The character biography traces your character's life from birth up until the time the story begins. It's a time when you can go into the childhood, the first 10 years, the second 10 years, the third 10 years, and define the forces working is research. Now, there's two kinds of research. One is live research, where you find a person and interview him or her to get some real background on the subject and the character that you're writing about. The other kind of research is text research, and that's where you go into the library and read books on the subject, old newspapers and magazines, and you can scroll through microfilm, anything that can get you more knowledge and insight into the actual subject matter. So now I want to talk about 3 areas of your character's life during the course of the screenplay. They are your character's professional life, your character's personal life, and your character's private life. Now, what does your character do for a living? What are the relationships that occurs in your character's job? What kind of a relationship does your character have with his or her boss, with other people? You have to define your character's personal life. The third thing, what about your character's private life? Private life is what your main character does when he or she is alone. What kind of hobbies does he or she have? Do they work out? Do they tend plants? Do they have pets? All these are personal aspects of your character's life. So now I want to talk about what I call the circle of being. Suppose in Titanic, there was a point in Jack's life about the time he was 15 or 16, and he met and fell in love with a girl, his first real love. And she was from a higher class than he was. And her parents forbid her to see young Jack because he did, quote, not belong to their particular class. And carrying this analogy a little further, what if Rose was always independent, always defiant, and deliberately created a relationship with the son of one of their servants? They were the best of friends, but her mother refused to let her see the young boy again. What would that do to Rose's character? Now in Thelma and Louise, plot point 1 is when Harlan is attempting to rape Thelma, and Louise shoots him. That's the key incident of the story. And that's really the start point of the movie, because that's the function of plot point 1. That's the true beginning of your screenplay. Later on in the story, we find out that Louise has been raped as a young girl when she was living in Texas. Now that prior rape, which is never seen, only alluded to, creates the emotional fabric causing Louise to pull that trigger. The circle of being is that event in your character's life that emotionally parallels and impacts the storyline. It's an event that happens to your main character when he or she is about 12 to 18 years old. And this is the age period where some kind of traumatic event could conceivably occur that would affect the entire course of your character's life. It might be the death of a parent or of a loved one. It could be physical abuse that results in a deep emotional scar. It could be a physical event or injury, or quite possibly a move to a new city or country. In Thelma and Louise, when she was raped and unable to obtain any sense of justice in Texas, that became the incident that formed her behavior. So if you go into your character's life and ask yourself what traumatic incident might have occurred to him or her between the ages of 12 and 18, see what happens. That event is known as the circle of being. Now remember what Henry James said. What is character but the determination of incident? And what is incident but the illumination of character? The circle of being helps create your character, and it's a wonderful tool that lets you dig into the emotional substance and dimension of your character. So now I want to summarize the assignments that I want you to do for the creation of your character. Number 1, write a character biography of your main character in about 5 or 7 pages or more. Here's how to do it. First, determine your main character. What's his or her name? Where was he or she born? How old is your main character when the story begins? And what does his or her father do for a living? What kind of childhood did your character have? Happy, sad, lonely, introverted, or extroverted? An only child, or were there any brothers or sisters? What was your character's life like during the first 10 years? Was your character always getting into trouble? Was he or she a good student? Who were his or her friends? Go into your character's second 10 years. What was your character's life like between the ages of 10 and 20? Did your character like school? And what about his or her relationship with teachers? Any clubs that he or she belonged to? What about high school? What about friends? First love affair? Was your character active in sports? Any dreams of college? And what happened after your character graduated your character? Go into your character's life between the ages of 20 and 30. Did they go to college? If not, what kind of jobs did they have? What about girlfriends, boyfriends, marriage? How did your character's dreams and aspirations collide with reality? Remember, we're after conflict, not some kind of romantic notion. What are the relationships in your character's life? Define them. Articulate them. Don't be too attached to what you think your character's life should be like. Let your character tell you who he or she is. Just let your mind go and have fun with this. Remember, this is an exercise that gives your character a voice. What if your character's older than 30? You do the same thing. Go into their professional life, their personal life, their private life. Create your character. Here's how we do it. In free association or automatic writing, just throw down all your thoughts, words, and ideas. Don't worry about grammar or punctuation or chronology. To do this exercise, you don't want to be distracted by phones or friends, housework, or children. Find a few hours where you can turn off the phones and just be one-on-one with yourself. Spend as much time as you want with it. This is an exercise for you and for nobody else. Now, I may tell you to write 5 or 7 pages, but do more if you want. Start do anything I need to do to give me more insight and dimensions in my characters. So while I'll tell you to write 5 or 7 pages, I myself may sometimes write up to 27 pages. Sometimes you find your character's biography feels forced or contrived. If that's the case, try writing in first person. For example, my name is John James. I was born on April 4th, 1956 in Boston. My father was a retired school teacher and my mother a nurse, and so on. Sometimes you can use some of these incidents or events of your character's biography in your screenplay. The rule is, if it works, use it. If it doesn't, don't. This is an exercise that forms character. And remember, have fun. Write in longhand if you want, or on computer or pad and paper. It really doesn't matter. Assignment number 2. I want you to write short essays on your character's professional life, your character's personal life, and your character's private life. Now, this area occurs during the course of your screenplay. It's a way to create something you can cut away to and expand your characters' lives. Number 3, I want you to write your character's circle of being. In free association, in about a page or two, write up that emotional event that occurred in your character's life, which may perhaps parallel the storyline. And number 4, I want you to define and articulate your character's dramatic need, your character's point of view, your character's attitude, and any change your character goes through. That concludes assignment 1 by 1 at your own pace. Take your time, have fun, and I'll see you on the next tape. Created our characters. Now we're getting ready to prepare for writing the screenplay. When we begin structuring our storyline, we have to remember that Act 1 is a unit of dramatic action. It's a part, but it's also a whole. We structure Act 1 on 14 3x5 cards. Each card represents a scene or a sequence in the screenplay. So how does your screenplay open? What's the scene or sequence that opens the storyline? Write it down in no more than 5 words. Why 5 words? Because all you need to do is to describe each scene or sequence. And if you write any more, it's way too much. So here's the way we do it. First, we know the opening of Act 1, and we know the plot point at the end of Act 1. So you can take those 2 scenes and write them down on 2 cards. So now we have 12 cards left to fill. As an example, I'm going to illustrate Act 1 of The Shawshank Redemption on these 14 cards. Do it the same way for your own storyline. Start with your opening, card 1. So this is card 1 of Act 1 in The Shawshank Redemption. There are 3 visual themes here: Andy in the car, at his trial, and when he's sentenced. Card 2, Red is rejected for parole. Card 3, Red is in the yard with friends. Card 4, Andy arrives at Shawshank. Card 5, bets are taken. Card 6, the warden gives rules. Card 7, in the shower, getting clothes, going to his cell. Card 8, the first night in prison. Card 9, fat ass is beaten. Card 10, breakfast the next morning. Card 11, in the shower with the girls. Card 12, in the laundry. Card 13, Red playing catch. Card 14, Red and Andy asking for the rock hammer. So do it the same way for your own storyline. Start with your opening, card 1. Then lay down the plot point at the end of Act 1, which is card 14. Then begin throwing down your thoughts and ideas for each of the scenes you need to get from the beginning to the plot point at the end of Act 1. Doesn't matter whether they're in chronological order or not, just lay them down. Then look at them, go over them, then put them into the correct order. Once you've established the order, the progression of the scenes, then go back and read them over and over and over again. This begins a psychic process that allows you to organize the material and fill up the content of Act 1. So the next thing I want you to do is write up your backstory. The backstory is what happens to your main character either a day or a week or an hour before the story begins. What happens to your main character? You know, we're looking for something dramatic. For example, Suppose your story deals with Jim being charged with embezzlement, and he must prove his innocence. So let's say your story begins, card 1, at 9 a.m. Monday morning, with Jim arriving at the office. So for a backstory, we might have this. Suppose on Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, Jim goes to his boss and asks for a raise, and his boss says no. Do you see what happens? It creates an emotional tension in your story that begins from page 1, word 1. It presents a dramatic action. Backstories do not deal with washing the dog and going to the market. They should influence, and then he goes out and gets a gun. Notice, too, that your backstory deals with a specific event. It's not a general thing happening like the cards. And remember, when you're doing the cards, you're doing the cards. And when you're writing the screenplay, you're writing the screenplay. For your assignment, I want you to structure Act 1 on 14 3x5 cards with no more than 5 words per card. Then I want you to write up the backstory in a page or 2 in free association. Now we're almost ready to start writing our screenplay. The first thing we have to understand is that screenplays are written in a certain form. The form itself is so easy, it's difficult. So let's take a look at a page from The Shawshank Redemption. Notice the location of the shot, called the slug line. That's all in capital letters and has the notation interior or exterior. Then the location of the scene or the shot. And then there's the time of day or night or morning, afternoon or evening. Now look at the description. It goes from margin to margin and is single-spaced. Then look at the dialogue. The person speaking is in capital letters and placed in the center of the page. The dialogue is also in the center of the page. That's the basic form of the screenplay. And within that form, there are thousands of variations. The best aid you can use when you're writing a screenplay is a screenplay formatting software program. And the best one, both for Windows and Mac, is called Final Draft. It's called a standalone program because of creativity. Hollywood has always had its own rules about how a screenplay should look. I've taught entire classes in the craft of screen formatting because in my experience, if I receive a screenplay to read and it's not formatted properly, you know where it goes? Right into the wastebasket. That's why Final Draft is such a valuable tool. It does all the formatting for you. You don't have to do anything except push the tab and enter. And it's the best screenwriting software available. Now let's establish the grammar of the screenplay. We're going to be talking about the shot, what the camera sees, the scene, or the unit or cell of dramatic action, and the sequence. Now the sequence is a series of scenes connected by one single idea with a definite beginning, middle, and end. The dinner sequence in Titanic, for example. Remember when Jack gets dressed up in his borrowed tux and is invited to dinner in the first-class dining room as a reward for saving Rose? We see him arriving in the outer area. He looks at the other first-class passengers. Cal comes by with Rose's mother and doesn't even notice him. Then Rose descends the staircase, and he offers her his arm, and they go into the dining room. The scene changes to Jack escorting Rose down the stairwell and into the dining room. And that's a new scene, because we've basically changed the place. Then they enter the dining room. And that, too, is a new scene, because we've changed the place, not the time. Those 3 shots compose the beginning of the sequence. The middle of the sequence is what happens at the table. We see all the silverware laid out, and Molly tells them to start at the end and work toward the plate. And here's where we see the exchange of their points of view. When you can create different points of view, you create conflict. Remember The man says, all life is a game of luck. Cal replies, a man makes his own luck. And Jack tells them, we all have to play the hand we're dealt with because life is a gift. That's how we generate conflict within the scene. The end of the sequence is when the men leave to smoke their cigars and drink their brandy. Another good example of a sequence is when Titanic hits the iceberg. It's a great sequence to study, so you're absolutely clear about the distinctions between the scene and the sequence. It begins with the lookouts seeing the iceberg, reporting it. The engine room stops the engine. The crew hopes and prays. And then we see the ship actually hitting the iceberg. Water explodes into the hold, and that's really the beginning of the end. Okay, so we're now ready to start writing. You have to think of the opening of your screenplay, the first 10 pages, as a unit of dramatic action. So what's the first scene or sequence that takes place? Is it action or is it character-driven? You must establish 3 essential things within the first 10 pages of your screenplay. Number 1, who is your main character? Who is the story about? Number 2, what's the dramatic premise of your story? That is, what it's about. And 3, what's the dramatic situation? That is, the circumstances surrounding the action. Now, those 3 things must be established. In The Shawshank Redemption, the main character is Andy Dufresne. We see the dramatic premise. As he's drinking, he pulls out and loads the gun. The dramatic situation is also seen, as we learn in the courtroom that the woman and man about to make love are his wife and her lover. In Titanic, we first meet Rose as an old woman. Then we flash back to the time she arrives on board. We also meet Jack at the same time. We see him winning his ticket in a poker game. So this visual introduction already gives us an insight into his character. These 3 threads of storyline are called the inciting incident. Then, when Andy is sentenced to 2 life terms back to back, the dramatic premise and the situation is the fact that he claims that he's innocent. So we know who he is, what the story is about, he's being sentenced to Shawshank, and 3, the situation. He's being convicted of killing his wife and her lover. And then we cut to Shawshank Prison, we meet Red, and it's from his point of view that we see Andy arrive. We see all the new prisoners get off the bus, enter the holding area, and the warden gives them his opening talk. Now, what we're seeing is from the main character's point of view. On page 10, Andy Dufresne enters the Shawshank Prison, and we see this from his point of view. So the main character and the reader or viewer are united because they both see things at the same time. It's a wonderful rule to keep in mind. We see him hosed down, given his clothes and bedding, and entering his cell. Welcome to Shawshank. And that's the first 10-page unit of dramatic action in the screenplay. The same with Titanic. Though it's a much longer screenplay, we have to set up and establish the storyline within the first 10 pages. So we meet the Bill Paxton character, set up his diving for the Titanic, show his struggle to retrieve the strongbox, and the search for the necklace. And then we cut to Rose as an old woman, throwing pots, still harboring that creative dynamic. And she watches the TV story about recovering the safe from the interior of the Titanic. And then she makes contact with the Bill Paxton character. She arrives on board the diving vessel, and there we begin her story. On page 10, we're with the young Rose as she arrives at the dock for the maiden voyage of the giant cruise ship. Writing the second 10 pages is fairly straightforward. The rule to follow is this. Think of ways your main character can be in every scene during the second page unit of dramatic action. we learn what the main character learns. We're literally focusing on the main character through every scene in the second 10 pages. This is not always the case, of course, but it's a pretty good rule. Remember that the context for Act 1 is the setup, so we must set up our characters, situations, and relationships between the main characters and the major characters. So in this second 10-page unit of dramatic action, the rule is to focus on your main character. And now, as we go back into the Shawshank Redemption and the second 10 pages, the bet is point of view. And we see that Fat Ass can't make it. He's hauled out of his cell and severely beaten by the prison guard. The next morning, when Andy goes for breakfast, he finds a maggot in his food and donates it to Jake the Crow. He inquires about Fat Ass, and we learn that he's died. That's the second 10-page unit of dramatic action of Act 1. So now it's time to set up plot point 1. We already know what it is, but how are you going to dramatize it? And more importantly, what scenes need to be written to get you to plot point 1, that incident, episode, or event that hooks into the action and spins it around into another direction, in this case, Act 2. There are usually 2 or 3 scenes needed to get you to plot point 1. What are they? Define them. Clarify them. In The Shawshank Redemption, we see Andy Dufresne in the laundry room and being approached by the sisters in the shower room. Plot point 1 is when he meets Red and asks if he can get him a rock hammer. This scene is plot point 1 because it establishes the relationship between Andy and Red. In character, the dramatic premise, what your story is about, and the dramatic situation, the circumstances surrounding your story. Once we've completed that, we go into the second 10 pages. Now remember, this too is a unit of dramatic action. Assignment 2. In the second 10-page unit of dramatic action, I want you to follow the focus of your main character. Your main character should be in every single scene. Of course, it doesn't always work out this way, but try to include that focus on your character in these 10 pages. The third assignment, I want you to establish and set up the 1 or 2 scenes needed to write plot point 1. We already know what plot point 1 is. What are those 1 or 2 scenes needed which will lead you directly into the plot point at the end of Act 1? So those are your 3 assignments. Now let's do it. To give you an overview, here's what Act 1 looks like on the paradigm. Notice it's broken down into 3 basic units of dramatic action. The first 10 pages, where you establish the main character, dramatic premise, and dramatic situation. The second 10 pages, where you follow focus on the main character. And the third 10 pages, where you isolate and define those 1 or 2 scenes which are needed to set up plot point 1, and then you write plot point 1. At that point, we're ready to begin entering Act 2. Now it's time to prepare Act 2. Act 2 is a unit of dramatic action that's approximately 60 pages long. It begins at the end of plot point 1 and continues until the end of plot point 2. It's held together with a dramatic context known as confrontation. All drama is conflict. Without conflict, you have no character. Without character, you have no action. Without action, you have no story. And without story, you ain't got no screenplay. We always enter Act 2 by defining your character's dramatic need, what your main character wants to win or gain or get or achieve during the course of the screenplay. So what happens at plot point 1? Remember that plot point 1 is the true beginning of your story. Does your character's dramatic need change? From what to what? Can you define it? Articulate it? What's the incident or event that happens at plot point 1? Where's your story going? And what changes will your character be going through? What obstacles will be confronting your character? In order to map out the action of Act 2, we first have to structure the action. Act 2 is a 60-page unit of dramatic action, so to jump in and plan that much action can become very confusing. It's very easy to become lost in the maze of your own creation. But there's a way to gain control over your material. When I first started teaching, I discovered that people jumping into the action of Act 2 had a tendency to lose sight of their story. I understood from my own experience that it's very easy to work in units of 30 pages, but very difficult to work in a 60-page unit of dramatic action. The solution? I discovered ways to create a midpoint, an incident or event that's a plot point, but it serves a different function. Now, the midpoint occurs around page 60, and it serves a very specific function. First, it breaks Act 2 into two basic units of dramatic action, the first half of Act 2 and the second half of Act 2. The midpoint itself is a plot point, but its function is to become a link in the chain of dramatic action and to break Act 2 into two basic units of dramatic action, the first half of Act 2 and the second half of Act 2. The first half of Act 2 goes from the end of plot point 1 to the midpoint, and the second half of Act 2 goes from the midpoint to plot point 2. In The Shawshank Redemption, for example, Andy meets Red at plot point 1. They begin their relationship, and Andy gets settled in his routine in prison. But as he begins to gain the warden's respect and trust, he's assigned to the library, and there he writes the legislature for additional funds to help fund the library. For 6 years, he writes 1 letter a week, sometimes 2 a week, in order to raise the funds for the library. Finally, a check and cartons of books arrive. And when they arrive, Andy Dufresne locks himself into the warden's office and plays an aria from a Mozart opera. He refuses to open the door, and he plays that aria over the loudspeakers, thus incurring the wrath of the warden. And for that little stunt, he's sent to the hole for a week. And when he comes out, he says it's the easiest time he's ever done. That incident, playing the aria, is the midpoint, because it links the action of the first half of Act 2 with the second half of Act 2. It is a link in the chain of dramatic action. So, how do you determine the midpoint? Well, first of all, we know 4 things. We know the ending, we know the beginning, we know plot point 1 and plot point 2. We know what action, what scene, or sequence will carry the storyline forward to the plot point at the end of Act 2. Now, it's that incident that spins the story around into another direction, the second half of Act 2. The midpoint's an important structural ingredient to the second act of your screenplay. In Titanic, for example, we know that at plot point 1, Jack saves Rose from leaping off the Titanic, and that begins their relationship. And it's that relationship that governs the action during the first half of Act 2. They get to know each other. They confront the obstacles of Cal and her mother trying to force them apart. Jack dresses in a borrowed tux in appreciation for saving Rose's life, and little by little, bit by bit, they begin to know each other and open up to each other. As a matter of fact, we might say that the sub-dramatic context of the action of the first half of Act 2 is getting to know each other. That sub-theme is what drives all the action forward during this portion of the screenplay. This culminates in their making love in the back seat of the car, and this leads us directly into the midpoint of dramatic action. So you can see that at plot point 1, Jack saves Rose from jumping off the ship. The action of the first half of Act 2 is their relationship, getting to know each other. And the midpoint is when they make love, just before the Titanic hits the iceberg, which leads us into the second half of Act 2. Now, you can also say that the midpoint could be hitting of the iceberg, and you'd be absolutely right. That is the key incident, the centerpiece of the entire film. But the story is really about the relationship between Rose and Jack. So their relationship is consummated when they make love. But either one could be structurally identified as the midpoint of Act 2. It happens when they hit the iceberg, and that leads us into the subdramatic context of the boat sinking and the survival of Jack and Rose, along with the rest of the passengers. That's the action that holds this entire unit of the second half of Act 2 together and leads us to plot point 2. When Rose leaves the lifeboat she's on and runs back to be with Jack, she knows she might die. But if she dies, she'll be in the arms of her lover. So the sub-theme for the second half of Act 2 could be called Staying Together. That's the importance of the midpoint, to connect the first half of Act 2 with the second half of Act 2. The midpoint is the link in the chain of dramatic action. So we can see how the action of Act 2 is structured. Jack saves Rose's life at plot point 1. The first half of Act 2 deals with their relationships, leading to the midpoint where they make love in the backseat of the Renault in the hold just before the Titanic rams into the iceberg. And that sets up the second half of Act 2. Their efforts to get a lifeboat and survive the ordeal is what keeps the action going. And that leads directly to the plot point at the end of Act 2, when Rose leaves the lifeboat and chooses to stay with Jack. If they die, they're going to die together. So now we have 2 units of action in Act 2. The first half of Act 2 and the second half of Act 2, which is connected by the midpoint. Now you may say that hitting the iceberg is really the midpoint of the screenplay. And you'd not be wrong in assuming that. However, we have to remember that this is a love story about Rose and Jack, and they're the main characters in the film, and they happen to be on the Titanic. So if you say that, you'd be right. But the story is about their love affair, which ultimately transcends time, and plot point 2 are the structural elements that hold the entire screenplay together. However, when you're writing Act 2, you need a little more help than that. The first half of Act 2 and the second half of Act 2 are approximately 30 pages in length. The first half of Act 2 begins at plot point 1 and goes until approximately page 60. The second half of Act 2 goes from the end of the midpoint to the plot point at the end of Act 2. So the first half goes from about page 25 or 30 in the normal movie to the midpoint, about page 55 or 60. And then the second half of Act 2 goes from about page 60 to approximately page 80, and the midpoint about 62 pages in. And plot point 2 is about page 88. In Titanic, plot point 1 occurs around page 33, the midpoint around page 83, plot point 2 about page 116. But we're more concerned with form than page numbers. Now, how do we go about structuring Act 2? We know the 3 basic structural points. The next thing we have to do is determine the subdramatic context for the first half of Act 2. What is the main action or storyline that holds that material together? In Shawshank, the first half of Act 2 focuses on the survival of Andy and the developing relationship with Red. But the second half of Act 2 deals with Andy established in his prison life, and now he wants to pass on his education. He wants to teach others to use their abilities. That would be the subdramatic context for the first half and the second half of Act 2. What I've discovered in working with writers over the years is that to now structure Act Two, we need one major sequence in the first half of Act Two and one major sequence in the second half of Act Two. That will give you enough story or plot information to lay down the action of what happens in the first and second half of Act Two. Now remember, a sequence is a series of scenes connected by one single idea with a complete beginning, middle, and end. It can usually be expressed in a few words, like a wedding, funeral, chase, race, fight, love, escape, and so on. For example, in Titanic, the one sequence that binds the first half of Act Two together is after Jack rescues Rose at plot point 1. And then in appreciation, he's invited to dinner. Now that's an important sequence because we see he can hold his own with the upper class. And when he arrives, dressed in his tux, it kicks the relationship between Jack and Rose to another level because she would not be so forward with him unless he measured up to her standards. So the subdramatic context for the first half of Act Two would be exploring their relationship. And this leads directly to the midpoint where they make love, survival, and their beginning relationship. The midpoint is when he receives the books from the library and plays the aria from the opera. Now, in order to build this first and second half of Act Two, we need one major sequence that holds the material together. This major sequence is what I call pinch 1 and pinch 2. Now, the definition of a pinch is simple. It's a sequence that keeps the action moving forward to the midpoint or plot point 2. More importantly, it's a sequence that keeps the story on track moving forward. So when we're building Act Two, we build it in units of dramatic action. We build the first half of Act Two and the second half of Act Two. And it's pinch 1 and pinch 2 that keeps the action moving forward. For example, in Titanic, pinch 1 is when Jack has dinner with Rose's fiancé Cal and the others. Pinch 2 is when Jack is chained to the pipe in the cabin, and she forsakes her own safety to go back and rescue him. It's that action point that keeps the story moving forward. And when she saves him, they're together, firmly together. And they'll either go down with the ship or be rescued. And we know, of course, that he will become the instrument of her salvation. So we can see how it works. Jack and Rose meet within the first part of the screenplay, and he rescues her at plot point 1. The first half of Act Two deals with their relationship, and pinch 1 is when they have dinner with Jack in a tux. The midpoint is when they make love, and pinch 2 is when she rescues him and forsakes her own safety in order to die. They're going to die together. Now, in The Shawshank Redemption, pinch 1 is when the warden launches a search of Andy's cell and finds him clean. It's his way of determining whether Andy can be trusted to work in the library and guide the prison guards on their to Shawshank. Andy then takes the young man under his wing and learns that he was a cellmate with the prisoner who was actually responsible for killing his wife and her lover. All the time he's been in prison, some 19 years, he felt he was serving time, not for the murders, but because he was a bad husband. And we, the audience, simply accepted the fact that he was guilty. It's a story point that was set up at the beginning and then buried under the action. It's a beautiful example of structuring and incorporating flashbacks into a screenplay. So here's your assignment for writing Act Two. You already know 4 things. You know your ending, we know your beginning, plot point 1 and plot point 2. Now you need to determine the midpoint, that incident, episode, or event that keeps the story moving forward between plot points 1 and 2. In Shawshank Redemption, it was receiving the library books. In Titanic, it was when they make love, just before the iceberg hit. Now, the midpoint could be a major dramatic incident, or it could be simply a silent pause of recognition. There's no right way to construct the midpoint. There is only your storyline. So the first thing we do to structure Act 2 is determine the midpoint. And once you've established that incident or event, you can then determine the subdramatic theme that takes place during the first half of Act 2, from plot point 1 to the midpoint. Only when you have the context of this unit of dramatic action can you determine pinch 1. Now, go into the second half of Act 2. You know the midpoint, and you know plot point 2. So what's the theme of action that keeps the story moving forward to plot point 2? That's your subdramatic context. Write it down on the paradigm. Next, determine pinch 2. That sequence that keeps the storyline on track, heading toward plot point 2. Now, the nice thing about structure is that it's flexible. As mentioned, it's the tree that bends in the wind, but doesn't break. We can always move these structural elements up and down or forward or backward on the paradigm. This is just a start point. It's not the end point at all. So here's how it goes. Once you've structured these elements, we're ready to begin structuring Act 2. Remember, structure means to build or put together. So now we're going to build Act 2 in 2 different units of dramatic action. First, we're going to start with the first half of Act 2. Take 14 cards. And then we're going to do what we did when we were structuring Act 1. Remember your subdramatic context. Lay out these 14 cards in free association for the first half. Just lay them down. Now, pinch 1 will be what number card out of 14? 7, of course. It occurs about halfway through the first half of Act 2. So lay out the cards now for the first half of Act 2. Go over and over them until they feel comfortable. Remember that the essence of Act 2 is conflict, confrontation. So seek out those conflicts whenever and wherever you can. We're working in 30-page units of dramatic action, so write the first half of Act 2. And when you've finished writing the first half of Act 2, you stop. Then you go into the second half of Act 2. You lay out the cards. You lay out the subdramatic context. Then you write the second half of Act 2. One more thing. Since plot point 1 is really the true beginning of your story, sometimes as you're writing the first half of Act 2, there may be a tendency to lose your way in the story. Now, if and when that happens, just continue your writing, and you'll find that around pinch 1, you'll see the storyline simply seems to glide into place. It's really a wonderful opportunity to carry out the creative Act 2. So now it's time to prepare and write Act 3. Act 3 is a unit of dramatic action that goes from the end of plot point 2 to the end of the screenplay. It's approximately 22 to 30 pages long, but in reality it could be anywhere in that area. It's held together by the dramatic context known as resolution. Now, once again, it's important to remember that resolution means solution. So what is the solution of your screenplay? Does your character live or die, succeed or fail, win the race or not, get married or not, get divorced or not. Solution does not mean end. So this unit of action deals with the solution of your story. You already have, does it still hold up, or are you thinking of changing it? People change their endings all the time. So it's something you can really think about, something you have a choice as to what action you take. Many times during the writing of this unit of dramatic action, you may feel comfortable with the material until you reach the last scene or sequence. And then you realize that the ending doesn't work, that it's not very effective, that it doesn't say what you want it to say. So what? You can always change it. The solution to your storyline was the very first decision you made about your story. So look at the paradigm. When you reach the plot point at the end of Act 2, you'll usually have one or two things which have been left unresolved. What are they? Can you articulate them, define them? In Shawshank Redemption, the plot point at the end of Act 2 is when Andy escapes. But we don't know how he escaped or where he went. And we don't know what's going to happen to Red once Andy's gone. Remember, Red doesn't really believe in hope. And yet hope is the one thing that sustains Andy. It is this one character trait that separates Andy from Red. And learning to hope becomes the ignition for Red's transformation. Now, if you look at the movie, one of the last shots shows Red on the bus after he's broken his parole, saying, "Get busy living or get busy dying." In Titanic, it's very much the same. Plot point 2 is when Rose leaves the lifeboat she's in and decides to tie her fate with Jack. They'll go down together at the end, whatever that may be. So, do they live or die? And what happens to Cal and the others? We know the ship's going to sink, but what's going to happen to the two of them? And if Rose is the one to survive, which she will be, how she's going to live her life from here on out? As an artist, a creative thinker, or as an appendage, a trophy to some man somewhere? Remember, the very first image we see of Rose, she's throwing a clay pot on a wheel. At the end, when she offers the heart of the ocean back to the Atlantic, we see her peacefully closing her eyes, and we see her surrounded by her pictures. We see her on horseback, in an airplane, as an actress, all those things in her life that she really owes to Jack. And once we know what's going to happen to her, we only need to see how. She's able to retell her story with Jack, and as a final letting go, she throws that necklace overboard. Her relationship with Jack is finally complete after some 70 or 80 years. And then she goes back to bed, and with a last look at her beloved pictures, she closes her eyes. In sleep? In death? And then we go underwater into the wreck of the Titanic, and then into the way it was. And there we finally see Jack and Rose united after all these years. It completes the storyline. It's finally resolved. They are together again. And that's what we're aiming for when we write Act 3 of the screenplay. So take a piece of paper and write down the one or two things which are left unresolved at plot point 2. What are they? Define them. Articulate them. What one or two elements are left unresolved at plot point 2? Once you've done that, structure Act 3 with 14 cards, 1 card per scene, though we know that's a contradiction. But just lay it out. You already know the ending of the story. All you have to do now is articulate it visually. Many times in an action-adventure movie, for example, the ending becomes one long dramatic sequence. Titanic is that way. Other films to check out where this happens are Witness, Crimson Tide, Silence of the Lambs, Terminator 2. In other films, character pieces or love stories or romantic thrillers, you have a line of action that resolves the one or two elements which need to be resolved. Out of sight, Thelma and Louise, Dances with Wolves, Pulp Fiction are very good examples to look at and study. Now we're ready to start writing Act 3. You know, we're lucky in a way. If we set up everything as it should be in Act 1, then Act 3 literally writes itself. You just have to put yourself in front of the computer and write. Sometimes, if you're writing a dramatic story, you may find Act 3 coming out with lots of humor, almost as if you were writing a comedy. Or conversely, if you're writing a comedy, maybe it all comes out like a drama, heavy and dense. If either case happens, just write it as it comes out and don't make any decisions about it. Just let it be. If you're writing a drama and it starts coming out like a comedy, write it down and don't be hard on yourself. Because once you've got it down, then you can go back and write it the way you really want it to be. Now, what about your ending? Does it work? Is it effective? Does it resolve the storyline? Is there anything you need to change or alter or streamline or take another direction? If so, think about what may be the best way to do it. And if you don't know if it works at all, ask yourself one simple question and don't worry about the answer. And that question is this: how would you like your story to end? Contemplate it. Let the answer come from inside you, and then try to capture the essence of that ending. Structure that ending. Find a scene or sequence that could embody that ending, and then lay it out. I want you to determine the one or two things that need to be resolved. Write them down. 2, I want you to structure Act 3 on 14 cards. 3, determine whether your ending works for now. And 4, now that you've done your preparation, you've done the cards, you're now ready to start writing. Congratulations. You've just written your first words on paper draft of your screenplay. It should be anywhere from 100 to 150 pages long, maybe longer. But what are you going to do now? Rewrite, that's what. We're going to take what you've written and we're going to polish, refine, hone, and it usually will shape itself as you're writing. The first stage in rewriting the screenplay is rereading the screenplay. You have to read what you've written from beginning to end without any interruptions. Just read it. Lock up all your pens and papers and pencils, turn off the phones, and just read the material. You'll find that you're going to be on a roller coaster of emotion. You're going to be wondering why you ever thought you could even write a script. Swing to the opposite extreme and say, hey, this ain't so bad. This works pretty good. Or, this scene is so long it seems to go on forever, but I know what I can do to cut it. Never mind what your comments are. Just read the material. This is an exercise that allows you to disengage from your subjective critical evaluation and become objective, at least as much as you can. So the first thing we do is read the screenplay from beginning to end, and do not take notes or make any marks or indications in the margins. Now, you want to be objective in this. That's the whole purpose of the thing. The second part of the exercise is to write 3 essays in free association or automatic writing. Now, I want you to answer 3 individual questions about your screenplay. The answer should not be thought out. You should just sit down and write and let whatever comes out come out. So here's the first essay I want you to write. It should be about 2 or 2.5 pages long. The first question is, what was it that originally attracted you to this idea? Was it a real-life experience? Was it a character you once met? Did you want to explore an emotional situation, the relationship between 2 or 3 characters? Did you want to write a mystery thriller? a love story, or an action-adventure, or a comedy? Go into your first awareness of the idea and try to locate your original impulse. You may want to find a quiet place in your home and sit quietly for a few moments, close your eyes, and see if you can recall the first real impulse that attracted you to your idea. Let come up whatever comes up. Don't judge it, don't analyze it, or do anything about it. Just let the thoughts, words, or ideas surface. Then you can catch them and throw them down on paper or on the computer screen. I don't want you to worry about grammar, punctuation, or anything else. After you've completed this first essay, you're ready to answer the second essay question. And here's the question that you answer in the same manner as the first essay. The question is, what kind of a screenplay did you end up writing? In other words, you may have wanted to write an action-adventure screenplay, like Titanic, with a strong love interest. But what you ended up writing was a strong romantic adventure love story set against a historical event, like the sinking of the Titanic. Or you may have wanted to write a character piece, only to discover that it's dull and boring and much too long and needs much more tension or conflict to keep the pace of the screenplay flowing. So the second question is, for you to answer, what did you set out to do and what did you end up doing? Again, you may have to think about this, so you might want to close your eyes and contemplate what kind of a screenplay you ended up writing. Go into its niches, also in a free association or automatic writing manner. And when you've completed this essay, you're ready to do the third essay. So I want you to answer this question. What do you have to do to change what you did do into what you originally wanted to do? In other words, this is what you ended up doing, and this is what you wanted to do. So what elements do you have to change to make this happen? The intention must equal the result. You may have wanted to write a love story with a strong action-adventure theme. But what you ended up doing is writing a strong action-adventure story that's played against the backdrop of a love story, or vice versa. So you'll have to change these elements of your storyline. You may have to strengthen and set up more of the action-adventure elements, and then tone down the love story. In any case, you're going to have to change and rework what you set out to do. And sometimes, what you ended up doing is much better than what you started out to do. In that case, you have to change the setup or act one of your screenplay. So you'll have one fluid line of action. The next step in the rewriting process is going through each act of the screenplay and working in individual units of action. For example, you'll rewrite Act 1. Then you'll rewrite the first half of Act 2. Then you'll rewrite the second half of Act 2. And then Act 3. And then you'll finish with polishing the screenplay. But you'll always be working in 30-page units of dramatic action, one step at a time. So with the results of your essays, go into Act 1, that individual unit of dramatic action. Now you take your pens or you go back to the computer and you read Act 1 and make any notes you need to make in the margins of the page. The chances are you may need to rewrite a major part of Act 1. That's usually the way it is. For example, if you've 20 scenes that make up Act 1, 10 5 scenes. It may be that you need to restructure the action of Act 1, that is, to completely redo the 14-card progression of events. You may have to and just lay out the storyline. Then go into Act 1 and rewrite it, adding, clarifying, condensing, modifying, doing whatever you need to do to make it better. Because that's the purpose of the rewrite. And when you've completed Act 1, go in. Most of the changes might be from plot point 1 to pinch 1, because that's the part that sometimes goes off track. but from pinch 1 to the midpoint, you're probably okay. Now do the same with the second half of Act 2. Change and rework what you need to do. Work on your transitions here, that smooth transitions between each scene. And do the same for Act 3. You want to smooth out the rough edges of the screenplay and keep your storyline moving forward from beginning to end, from beginning to end. Normally, rewriting the words on paper draft will usually take you anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks. Just keep writing one unit at a time, one section at a time. I call writing the second draft of the first draft screenplay the mechanical draft, because you're just trying to even out the edges of your story, to put it into a single line of dramatic or comedic action. You might still be a little bit long in your screenplay. If so, you're ready for the third, or what I call the polished draft of your screenplay. Adding some, working on your transitions, smoothing out the entire storyline from beginning to end. For me, this is my favorite part of writing the screenplay. I can hone and polish each scene, working on transitions, my character development, changing the dialogue. It becomes to see the movie in their heads, and yet you want it to be clear and concise and not overloaded with description or too many words. So I'd like to repeat something about your writing experience. It's redundant, but I think it's important for you to hear this again. You must find your own time to write. Your own time. I tell people they can write on the weekends. If you work full-time, you know that Saturday's errand day. Groceries, laundry, cleaning, whatever. But you can take an hour or two to look at this video, get your assignment, and write the screenplay. And that's why I've broken down the assignments into units of action. It's important to find your own time, your own discipline, so you can feel good about what you're doing. There's only one real thing to guide you, and that's your desire to sit down and write, to complete something that's yours. Because once you've completed your screenplay, you've accomplished a tremendous achievement. You've taken an idea, you've expanded that into a dramatic or comedic storyline, and then you've sat down and spent several weeks or months writing it, from inception through completion. It's a satisfying and rewarding experience because you did what you set out to do. Wear that proudly. Talent is God's gift. Either you've got it or you don't. But that should not interfere with the experience of writing. Writing brings its own rewards. Enjoy them. Pass it on. For more information about the art and craft of screenwriting, the following books are available at your local bookstore. Screenplay, The Foundations of Screenwriting. The Screenwriter's Workbook. The Screenwriter's Problem Solver. 4 Screenplays. And Selling a Screenplay. Available at all bookstores.